Adam Kinzinger is a former Republican congressman. Welcome to our program, Congressman Kinzinger.
Great to be with you. Thanks for having me back.
US President-elect Donald Trump will not abandon Ukraine, according to Bloomberg and Bloomberg sources in Europe. Meanwhile, Trump's Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, says that he would like to see the end of the war between Ukraine and Russia as good for Ukrainians as possible. What is your take on such statement, and do you see this publication and this statement as a sign of a major shift in Trump's stance on Ukraine?
Oh, man, I hope so. I don't think we know until we know. Look, I mean, the reality of it, if I'm just being honest, is I don't think Donald Trump really knows what he stands for. And so what you see is these people around him that are each coming up with their own interpretation. And we have to wait until Donald Trump gets into office to see what he gives. Now, more than likely, this is my belief, because Donald Trump really does not know this stuff. He's probably going to leave some of this up to the people that are dealing with this, whether it's going to be Marco Rubio or Pete Hegseth or whoever. And so I think you'll see whatever the plan is come together then. I mean, look, there's not a single person in this world except Vladimir Putin that does not want to see an end to this war. Nobody more than Ukraine. But we want to see an end in a way that doesn't lead to another war in 5 years. So I hope Donald Trump has made a major shift. What I do worry about is I don't think there's going to be much more aid coming from the United States, because I have a hard time seeing how the Republicans vote for that, which is unfortunately sad. Maybe I'm wrong.
Also, it is interesting that according to the latest publication on Financial Times, Trump's team would like Ukraine to negotiate with Russia from a position of strength. But how would it be possible to do so if the United States will not send military equipment to Ukraine?
Well, now here's where the possible good news could be, because I think there is a belief, and I agree with this belief, that if we negotiate. Now, personally, what I'd rather see is give Ukraine everything they need, take their land back, and then negotiate. However, if the negotiations begin now, I think there might be an understanding within this administration. I hope there might be an understanding that that is going to have to come with continued U.S. supplying of arms to Ukraine. Now, I think what that could look like, instead of kind of aid, it could look like a contract where the United States, similar to what we did to Afghanistan, we give military equipment. Ukraine buys that military equipment as it's able to do, which I think Ukraine would want to do anyway. And I think the understanding is that we have to arm Ukraine and make it so that Russia does not consider reopening that war in the future. Because if you all of a sudden say, Ukraine, you don't get any weapons from the United States, there's no peacekeepers in Ukraine, there's nobody monitoring, the border between Russia and Ukraine, and by the way, you can't join NATO, then all of a sudden it's just a matter of time until Vladimir Putin rearms and reengages in the war. And I think this administration understands that. So that's the good news.
You just mentioned some elements of the Kit Kellogg's plan on Ukraine. Do you believe that freezing the front lines and deploying peacekeeping forces and this all stuff from Kit Kellogg could work with Russia and could work with Ukraine? Do you personally believe in effectiveness of this plan?
Look, the only way, and again, I really am deferential to Ukrainians. I mean, you guys are the ones fighting this war. You get to make those decisions. So, I don't have any skin in the game, and I recognize that. My tendency is to believe that if we go from we'll freeze the current lines, if that is the starting point, then you have to start from that position with, if Ukraine gives up that land, obviously should never recognize those lands as Russian. That should always be recognized as occupied Ukrainian lands. But then Ukraine should have a military that, as it is today, is whatever it is, the 6th or 7th most powerful military in the world. It should stay that way. Secondarily, We should ensure that if there are no peacekeepers, American or European troops in there, that again, Ukraine has no restrictions on what it can do to defend itself. And I think those are the ways to start if you're going to freeze the current lines. And with that, you have to have a guarantee that Ukraine will eventually be in NATO. I mean, those are the only ways to guarantee that Russia doesn't reopen this war again. Otherwise, again, maybe, we'll see what ends up happening in terms of occupied Ukrainian lands. But you cannot start from a position of Ukraine gives up the land, because the idea that Ukraine has lost this war or is losing this war, and I hope your people hear this, is insane. Ukraine is winning this war. I mean, at this rate, with what Russia has taken of Ukrainian lands in the last 2 years, it would take over like 100 or 200 years for Russia to occupy Ukraine from 3 days, right? All a defending country has to do to win a war is to keep defending, and Ukraine's doing that brilliantly. So I think this negotiation should start from the position of not that Ukraine is losing and we have to negotiate, but Ukraine is actually winning this war. Now, how do we stop further bloodshed and further wars?
Retired General Ben Hodges also recently said that Russia today is in a more weak position rather than a year ago with the fall of Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria. How can you assess Russia's position before the start of these negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, and how can you assess Vladimir Putin's position right now? Would he be more weaker in talks with Donald Trump, as they have lost their military presence in Syria and have sustained such unsustainable losses in Ukraine and also Kursk region of Russia? The Ukraine's offensive is going on there.
Look, if you're a believer in God like I am, you have to believe that these things that have happened in the last few months were like divinely, inspired to happen before negotiations. The loss of Syria, nobody saw coming. And then it happened really quickly. And I think that's what we're on the edge of with the Russian economy. This could be tomorrow. This could be in a year, maybe 2 years. But all indications are the Russian economy is a paper tiger. And it's sitting where the former Soviet Union was, as of today, where the former Soviet Union was just before the fall of the Berlin Wall or the collapse of the Soviet Union. And Russia can't even take back its own land. It was invaded for the first time since World War II and hasn't been able to take that back. So Russia's a terribly weak country in a terribly weak position. I mean, if you think about the number of losses that the Russian military has had, I forget the number they started out with, but they've probably lost 70% of their original invading force. At the height of Iraq and Afghanistan, the United States had only committed something like 10 or 12% of our entire military to those wars. That Putin has committed his entire military. So, look, I think Ukraine can go in this very strongly. I think Russia's in a very weak position. And I think Vladimir Putin, in his mind, is just desperately hoping that something changes when Donald Trump becomes president. But if Donald Trump becomes president and signals that he's going to stand with Ukraine, I think I think Vladimir Putin will come hat in hand begging for an end to this war.
So if Donald Trump will support and stand behind Ukraine, do you feel that Vladimir Putin will not be able to properly sleep at night?
Correct. I mean, look, here's the reality. And I think Ukrainians know this more than anybody, but Russia's not going to win this war. The only way Russia could win this war is if the West abandons Ukraine, because the Ukrainian people, as sad as it is, the burden that you guys have to bear in this fight, you're willing to bear this burden to defend your country. I mean, who wouldn't be? My God, it's your country. This is what you were born in, what you grew up in. You're just asking that you have the tools. And I got to tell you, they used to think, when I was growing up as a kid, I always thought Soviet equipment and American, NATO equipment was the same. No, it's like this. NATO equipment crushes Russian equipment. And so the more that the Ukrainian military is being outfitted with NATO equipment, which is far more than it was even at the beginning of the full-scale war, the more lethal that the Ukrainian military becomes. You will not lose this war if the West continues to stand with you. And that's the other thing is, even if the United States pulls away, the Europeans have the ability, if they decide to equip Ukraine with everything Ukraine needs to win. But Europe has to wake up. And even 3 years after the start of the full-scale invasion, it seems like they're still rubbing their eyes in the morning and haven't had their coffee yet. They're not waking up to the real threat that Russia and China ultimately is.
Also, it's interesting that according to Financial Times, Donald Trump would not like to look weak on international stage if Ukraine if Ukraine loses this fight. Moreover, at the same time, he would not like to create this situation when Xi Jinping will invade Taiwan, because according to Financial Times, this could happen if Ukraine loses this fight. At the same time, Donald Trump says that he will meet with Vladimir Putin shortly after the inauguration. What is your take on such meeting, and do you believe that Vladimir Putin will agree with Trump's proposal on a ceasefire?
Look, I've met with Trump a number of times on foreign policy issues in the first Trump administration. He is nice to whoever is in the room. So I think the expectation that he's going to do something tough like Ronald Reagan would to Vladimir Putin is not the case. He'll probably sit there with Vladimir Putin and smile and tell him everything Vladimir Putin wants to hear. That doesn't mean that he's going to do everything Vladimir Putin wants him to do. But Donald Trump likes making people happy that are in the room with him. It's a really weird thing when you see it. Regardless, I think if they meet, fine. Again, nothing wrong with meeting. If the message is, look, look, Russia, we don't seek to expand a war with you, but we are not going to abandon Ukraine in this. I think that's an okay message to send. But yeah, I mean, the reality is we don't know what's going to come out of this. And I think it's important for Ukraine to basically stand and say, we're not going to give up, for the West to stand with them, for the United States to stand with them. And we'll see a successful outcome. Who knows, again, what's in Donald Trump's head. I do think what you open that question with, if you think back to when the United States left Afghanistan and how that really actually was the beginning of the end for Joe Biden, his popularity suffered. I'm still angry about Afghanistan as a veteran of Afghanistan. It made Joe Biden look really weak. If somehow, and I don't think this will happen, but if Ukraine somehow loses under Donald Trump, it will be a scar on his presidency forever. Forever. And I think that the American people do not want to see Ukraine lose. I hope you guys know that's obvious. So I do think that can be a very compelling deciding factor for him is, boy, Mr. President, you don't want to look as weak as you'll look if you abandon Ukraine. And honestly, he does recognize that in the next 4 years, there is a really serious threat of China's invasion of Taiwan. And for Ukraine to be able to defend itself sends very chilling feelings down the spine of Xi Jinping.
Also, there is a big thinking process and there's lots of discussions that if Vladimir Putin humiliates Donald Trump, then Trump can go after Vladimir Putin, and there could be a big confrontation between Trump and Vladimir Putin. What are the chances for this?
I mean, again, I don't know. I think it's if you think back to the early Trump administration, or early in the last Trump administration, remember he was very aggressive against Kim Jong-un, and then he wasn't. This stuff can go back and forth. I personally think, again, Donald Trump is scared to death to use America's military, which, look, I get it if you don't want to use America's military against Russia. I kind of disagree with that. I think that I actually think America's military should be used to defend Ukraine in Ukraine's territory at the request of Ukraine. But I understand it. There's a concern. But I also think, Donald Trump is volatile, and he's not volatile. He's not like explosive because he likes to keep people off guard. He just literally is that way. He's dramatic. He changes. And so, yeah, it's quite possible there could be a confrontation between the two of them. Look, I'll say this much in the broad scheme. I am much less pessimistic, so I'm more optimistic about the future of Ukraine under Donald Trump than I would have been a few months ago. That said, I obviously had my preference for who would win the presidency, but let's take what we can get right now.
That's because of Biden's cautiousness about sending military aid for Ukraine and failure to help Ukraine to actually win this war.
Yeah, look, Joe Biden gets credit for standing with Ukraine. I think genuinely wanting Ukraine to win. But there was that period of 6 months where Ukraine did not have American aid. And what was the White House doing? They were silent. They could have been shaming the Republicans in the House. They were silent. This fear, this paralyzing fear of nuclear escalation. Like, we forget that during the entire Cold War, the Soviet Union every day threatened to use nuclear weapons. It's just what they do. They're not interested in using it. They just do it. This paralyzing fear among the Jake Sullivans and the Harvard crowd that doesn't understand how fighting really works, but has their theories. Man, that is just, I'm sure Ukraine's going to be happy to get rid of that. The only question is what replaces it. At least the good thing is we're not going to have this, academic theories about what's going to happen. Instead, we'll have at least real world opinions about what could happen in Ukraine.
Also, it seems like Jake Sullivan, U.S. National Security Advisor, still thinks that they did the right job, right job on Ukraine. And what is your take on that?
Yeah, it's funny because what you'll see now is all these articles coming out about how great Jake Sullivan did. Well, Jake Sullivan has a lot of media contacts, and he is now trying to solidify his legacy. So he's actually finding these interviews, granting these interviews, and hope that it solidifies his legacy. Look, Jake Sullivan is a good guy. He's a good man that means very well. And again, there are areas where he does deserve a lot of credit, no doubt. But this fear of escalation, and now they're trying to defend this, what they're calling this salami approach. The slow frog boiling in the water is the only reason we didn't have a nuclear exchange. Look, Vladimir Putin knows well. He's not dumb. He hasn't been boiling in water. He knows the escalation train that's been happening, and his bluff has been called. And at every time, because he doesn't intend to use nuclear weapons. And so that certainly has been frustrating. Jake Sullivan's a good guy, but it'll be nice to get away from this fear of escalation. And hopefully the Trump administration doesn't fall into that same trap.
And do you believe that if Trump supports Ukraine, Vladimir Putin could surrender, could make some concessions and agree to an appropriate for Ukraine deal, at least to a ceasefire, but appropriate for Ukraine on appropriate terms?
Look, I honestly believe so. I'll say this. If I was president of the United States, I would make it clear that Ukraine is joining NATO. I'd make it clear that we are going to arm Ukraine to the teeth. And I'd even implement a no-fly zone over Ukraine with NATO jets to like we did with Israel, to destroy incoming projectiles. And then from there, I would start negotiations with Vladimir Putin and make it very clear to him that he can't go any further. Look, the one thing we know about the Russians is they'll advance until they hit a brick wall. And if they hit a brick wall, they usually don't try to go past that because they know they don't have the capability to. That's where you start negotiations from. And then, will there be some territory that's negotiated? Maybe, whatever. But it's going to be from a position of strength where Ukraine says, yeah, just so you know, you're never going to defeat us. So now that you know that, let's negotiate. So yes, I think it's possible that if Trump comes in and makes it clear, I don't think he'll ever make it clear that he only stands with Ukraine, because in his mind, he has to negotiate deals, which means he doesn't take sides, even if he's on a side. But I think in theory, if he comes in with that kind of an attitude, and his team does, Vladimir Putin will know he can't go any further. He can continue to chew little kilometers up of Ukraine, but it's going to take another 200 years to even get to Kyiv at the rate he's going.
Let's also cover another topic: Canada, Panama Canal, and Greenland. What is your reaction to these statements, and can you please share your assessment of each question separately, because these are really interesting topics?
Yeah, look, I mean, first off, Donald Trump is scared to death to use American military. So let's be clear, he's not intending to use the American military, even if he pretends he does. This is a big frustration of mine, because in our hemisphere right now, you have Venezuela, which is repressing their people, a stolen election similar to our friends in Georgia. And instead of Donald Trump talking about Venezuela, he's talking about our friends. Panama, Denmark, Greenland, Canada. So here's what happens is Donald Trump likes to look tough, but he doesn't like to provoke conflict. And if he would say some of the things he's saying about Russia or about China or about North Korea, then obviously that's dangerous because he may have to use the military. But when he says it about his friends, he knows that that's not going to lead to a real conflict. So look, Greenland is a very important place in terms of the race for the Arctic. And I think, it's important. The U.S. can have a military presence on Greenland, which we do have, versions of at least, that we have the ability to operate against the Russians out of there. You can do that with Greenland staying the same. Canada, obviously, is our number one trading partner. They're our friends to the north. It's silly to even talk about. And Donald Trump is doing that as a way to troll, because he's a child anyway. And then, Panama, look, the Panama Canal, there's a real concern that China is buying up the Panama Canal, and we cannot allow that. And I think we should be working diplomatically, economically, and otherwise to ensure that that doesn't happen. And frankly, if it does, then we have decisions to make. But going and just threatening the Panama Canal is kind of a bad way to start. And then lastly, let's talk about Mexico too, which is the president has said on day one, he's basically going to attack the drug cartels. It's much harder than it seems. But at the same time, look, I, as a military guy, I've operated against the cartels a little bit. There's nothing wrong with the United States military going after drug cartels. But we're not going to invade Mexico. Let's be very clear about that. So look, I'm glad the president is paying attention to our hemisphere. We've ignored it for a long time, and China and Russia have moved in. But it needs to be a real pay attention. So that includes things like Venezuela. And lastly, I'll say this. America is so big, it's so powerful, the military is so strong, we can focus on the Western Hemisphere and Ukraine and China at the same time. So let's do all of that and not abandon anybody in that spheres.
So you believe that Trump's arguments and Trump's statements about Panama Canal and Greenland are fair one and could be considered as a good option for the policy in a diplomatic means?
Yes, I think the concerns expressed about both are fair concerns. Again, yes, we did give up the Panama Canal. I don't know if we should have. We did. When we were in a good mood as a country and just giving everybody their own stuff back. But part of that is we need to make sure that access is still there and that China doesn't control it and that China is not using espionage on every ship passing through the Panama Canal, including our military, by the way. And then Greenland, yeah, it's a very important location. Now, the thing is, we can deal with those issues without threatening to invade or threatening Denmark, who's a great ally of ours, and Ukraine, as you all know very well. So I think there's a much better way to handle this than just come out and talk about, we're going to just take it over. It's silly. That's what a child does playing Risk, in junior high, not what a president should do.
Thank you, Congressman Kinzinger, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Slava Ukraine.